Hi, this is Professor Dawn, and in this video I'm going to explain how we find typical or usual values for binomial scenarios using the two standard deviation method. So let's take a look at this example. About 17% of adults have a fear of needles. So in a random sample of 45 adults, what is the typical number we would expect to have a fear of needles? So the first thing we're going to need to do in this scenario is we're going to need to calculate the mean and the standard deviation. So the mean is just 17% of those 45 adults. And that turns out to be 7.65, which I'm going to round to one decimal place. So about 7.7 is our mean. Now, our standard deviation is the square root of n, our sample size, times p, the probability someone has a fear of needles, times 1 minus p, the probability someone does not have a fear of needles. So that would be 0.83. And this turns out to be 2.5. Whenever we round, it's 2.51. Okay, so about 2.5. So we're going to take that information and now we're going to come up with the typical or usual number of adults out of a group of 45 we would expect to have a fear of needles. Okay, so using those numbers, we're going to use that 2SD method. And so the 2SD method says we take the mean and we add and subtract 2 times the standard deviation to come up with our lower bound and our upper bound. So in this case, this would be 7.7 plus or minus 2 times 2.5. Okay, so that's 7.7 plus or minus 5. And that tells us on the low end, 7.7 minus 5 is 2.7. And on the high end, 7.7 plus 5 is 12.7. But remember, binomial variables are discrete. Okay, we cannot have fractional parts of a number. So what we need to do is figure out where we want to round. And this is not as straightforward as just rounding using our regular rounding rules. What I'm going to do here on the number line is I'm going to kind of mark where about 2.7 would be, about right there, and where 12.7 would be. We're going to go about right there. Okay, the typical values are the whole number values that fall in between those two boundaries. So notice that would mean 3 on the low end, all the way up to 12 on the upper end. But notice if we just apply regular rounding rules to 12.7, we would round up to 13. But notice that 13 is out of bounds. So 13 is not a typical value. So in this case, our typical or usual values would start at 3 on the low end and go up to 12 on the high end. And we always use square brackets because that means we are including 3 and 12 in our answer. This is interval notation. So the typical values again would be from 3 to 12. So when we have 45 people, a group of 45 people who are randomly selected, it would be typical or usual to have somewhere from 3 to 12 of them be afraid of needles. Anything less than 3 or greater than 12 would be considered unusual.